The morning sun rose slowly over the land, painting the fields in golden light, and the soldiers of the small nation stood in perfect lines waiting for the sound of the horn that would start their daily drills. They were proud men and women, trained from youth to serve their country and defend its honor. Their fathers and grandfathers had fought before them, and every story told around the fire ended with victory and glory. They believed they were born for battle, that no enemy could ever defeat them. In every street and market of the capital city, people spoke with pride about their army. The old men said that no one in the world had the courage and strength like their warriors. The children played games where they pretended to fight enemies and win with ease. The nation lived inside a bubble of pride and confidence, certain that their strength was unmatched. The soldiers trained every day under the watchful eyes of their generals who wore medals that shined in the sun. The general of the main army was a man respected by all. His voice was deep and his words carried the power of belief. He would walk among the soldiers and tell them that they were the shield of the land, the ones chosen to protect their people from any outsider. They shouted in reply with passion in their voices and smiles on their faces. The people loved these moments because it made them feel safe and proud. But behind the cheers and pride there was something that no one wanted to see. The army had not fought a real war in many years. The world outside was changing fast, new weapons were being made, new tactics were being used. But inside this land, everything stayed the same. They still trusted in swords and rifles, in courage and noise, believing that bravery alone could win any battle. The young soldiers felt excitement more than fear. For them, war was a dream of fame, of songs and respect. They cleaned their weapons every night and imagined how their names would be remembered in history. Some of them even laughed at the idea of facing foreigners because they thought no one could stand against them. They had learned from stories, not from experience. The generals encouraged this pride. They gave speeches about the past, about how their ancestors had crushed every threat. No one talked about mistakes or about how the world outside had grown stronger. The pride was like a fire that made everyone warm but also blinded them from seeing the truth. One day, news arrived that changed everything. A border village had seen strange aircraft flying low in the sky. The villagers said they were not birds, not any kind of machine they had ever seen. They moved fast and silent, disappearing before anyone could understand. The generals laughed and said it was nothing to worry about. But soon reports came again and again, each one telling about strange soldiers seen near the border. These men did not wear the clothes of any known army. They carried weapons that no one recognized. The generals called a meeting. Around a large wooden table they discussed what to do. Some said it was a small matter. Others warned that it could be serious. But the highest voice in the room was the voice of the leader himself, who said proudly that no foreigner would ever dare to fight them. Everyone nodded in agreement because no one wanted to sound weak. The soldiers were ordered to prepare for inspection. They marched with confidence, their boots hitting the ground in rhythm, their flags flying in the wind. The people lined the streets to cheer for them. The mothers gave blessings. The children waved small flags, and the sound of drums filled the air. It was a moment of unity and pride. They believed they were invincible. They thought this was going to be another small victory that would bring honor to the nation. The general rode his horse through the ranks and smiled. He had seen many drills, but never a real modern war. Still, he believed that courage and tradition would be enough. When the army finally reached the border, they saw the hills standing quiet and green. The foreign forces were nowhere in sight. The soldiers laughed and set up their camps. The air was filled with stories and songs. But in the night, strange lights appeared far away. The foreign machines moved silently in the darkness. The local soldiers watched with confusion. They had never seen machines that moved without sound. Some thought it was a trick of the wind. Others said it was magic. They had no idea that they were being watched closely. The next morning, the first attack came. It was sudden and fast. The foreign weapons made no loud noise but destroyed everything they touched. The ground shook and the sky filled with smoke. The proud army tried to fight back, shouting and firing, but their bullets hit nothing. The enemy moved like shadows, appearing and disappearing before anyone could aim. The local soldiers ran in every direction, trying to understand what was happening. The generals shouted orders, but no one could hear them over the chaos. By the end of the day, hundreds were dead, and the survivors stood in silence, staring at the ruins of their camp. The generals called it a small loss, a surprise attack, something they would recover from soon. They told the soldiers to rest and prepare for revenge. But deep inside, fear had started to grow. The soldiers had seen something they could not understand. The foreigners were not like any enemy they had imagined. Their faces were calm, their moves precise, and their attacks unstoppable. Back in the capital, the news spread fast. The government called it a misunderstanding. The newspapers printed stories of heroism, and the people believed it. They clapped for the soldiers who returned for supplies and called them heroes. But those soldiers had seen the truth. Their eyes were different now, filled with confusion and questions. They spoke softly among themselves, wondering how such a small foreign group could defeat them so easily. Some said the foreigners used witchcraft. Others said they had weapons from the future. The general stood in his tent that night staring at the map. His hand shook slightly as he traced the lines of the border. He wanted to believe that his army could still win, but the sound of the explosion from the first attack still echoed in his head. He remembered the look in his soldiers' eyes, not of courage but of fear. Yet he pushed those thoughts away and told himself that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow they would fight harder and prove their strength. He did not know that this was only the beginning of a war that would change everything they believed about battle, courage, and strength. As the night grew darker, the wind carried the faint sound of machines moving again. The guards on duty looked into the distance and saw the same silent lights gliding across the sky. They called out to each other, unsure whether to be afraid or curious. The commander ordered them to stay alert, his voice trying to sound firm, though his heart was uneasy. In the stillness of that night, the soldiers realized something that words could not describe. For the first time in their lives, they were facing something beyond their understanding. They had always thought that they understood battle. But as the foreign lights grew closer, they began to understand that war was not just about bravery or strength. It was about knowledge, strategy, and the power to adapt. The night ended with the distant sound of thunder that was not thunder at all, but the coming of another attack. The soldiers tightened their grip on their weapons and waited for dawn, unaware that the war ahead would not only test their courage but also their very idea of what it meant to be strong. The next morning came with a heavy silence that hung over the camp like a fog. The smoke from the ruins still drifted in the air, and the soldiers moved slowly, their faces tired and pale. The generals tried to speak with confidence, but even their voices carried doubt. They told everyone that the attack from the foreigners had been a lucky strike, and that it would not happen again. The soldiers nodded, but no one believed it deep inside. They had seen how fast and precise the enemy moved, how strange their weapons were, and how helpless they had felt against them. The sound of explosions still echoed in their ears, and when they closed their eyes, they could see flashes of light and fire. The pride that once filled their hearts was replaced by quiet fear that no one dared to speak about. The general called a meeting under a large tent made of thick green cloth. The senior officers gathered around the table, their uniforms dirty and their eyes dark from lack of sleep. Maps were spread out before them, showing the border hills, the rivers, and the villages nearby. One officer pointed at the map and said that they should move their forces deeper into the forest for cover. Another said they should strike back immediately before the foreigners could prepare again. The general listened, his hands folded, his face calm but his mind troubled. He knew the army had never faced an enemy like this before. Their rifles and tanks were old, their training based on courage and tradition, not on new technology. But he could not let anyone see his worry. He spoke firmly and said that they would advance at dawn and show the foreigners that no outsider could step on their land without paying a price. The officers cheered weakly, though their voices lacked the power they once had. That night the camp tried to rest, but sleep did not come easily. Some soldiers sat around small fires, speaking in low voices. They shared stories of what they had seen, trying to understand who these foreigners were. One said that he had seen them wearing strange helmets with glass that glowed faintly. Another said they had machines that moved without wheels. They all agreed that the foreigners fought without emotion, silent and exact like shadows. A young soldier whispered that maybe they were not human at all. His friend laughed nervously but could not hide his fear. They were all waiting for something to happen, and the darkness made every sound seem louder than it was. When dawn broke, the army began to move forward. The sun was pale behind the clouds and the air smelled of smoke and metal. The soldiers walked carefully, their boots sinking into the wet ground. The general rode at the front, his eyes scanning the horizon. The hills looked empty, but everyone felt the same uneasiness, the same tightness in the chest that comes before danger. Then it began again. From the distance came a humming sound, soft at first, then louder. The soldiers looked up and saw small dark shapes moving through the sky. The general shouted for them to take cover, but before they could move, the air exploded around them. The foreign machines dropped something that burst into blinding light and sound. The ground shook and the soldiers threw themselves down, covering their heads. When the noise stopped, many of their trucks were gone and smoke rose from what was left. The soldiers tried to fight back, firing their rifles at the sky, but the foreigners were already gone. They did not stay to fight. They attacked and disappeared before anyone could see them clearly. The general's voice cracked as he shouted orders, but the confusion was too great. The men ran in different directions trying to find cover, some firing blindly into the air. After an hour, the noise faded, leaving behind silence broken only by the cries of the wounded. The field was full of twisted metal and scattered weapons. The general stood still, his face pale, his mind blank. This was not a battle. This was something else, something beyond what he understood. When they returned to camp, the officers avoided looking at each other. The soldiers sat quietly, their uniforms covered in dust. The general sent a message to the capital, reporting that the situation was under control, though he knew it was not true. The government sent back a short reply telling him to hold the line and wait for reinforcements. But everyone in the camp knew that reinforcements would not change anything unless they learned how to fight this new kind of enemy. Some of the younger officers began to whisper that the old ways were no longer working. They said they needed to learn how the foreigners moved and fought, but the older generals ignored them, saying that bravery and faith were all they needed. In the nearby villages, people watched the sky with fear. The sound of foreign aircraft had become common, and sometimes the ground would shake without warning. Families packed their belongings and fled deeper into the countryside. The old and the young walked for miles, carrying whatever they could. Some stopped soldiers on the road and begged for protection, but the soldiers themselves looked lost. They had no answers to give. The stories spread fast, and the people began to lose faith in the army that had once been their pride. Far away in their hidden base, the foreigners worked quietly. They spoke little, moving with calm precision. They studied every move of the local army, learning their habits, their weaknesses, their communication style. For them, this was not a war of hate, but a mission of control and order. They used advanced equipment that allowed them to see at night and strike without being seen. Their leader, a calm man with cold eyes, told his soldiers that they were not here to destroy but to teach a lesson about power. His words carried a strange calmness, and his men followed him without question. Back at the local camp, a young officer named Rehan sat alone near the fire. He was new, but he had already seen enough to understand that they were losing because they refused to change. He had watched the older generals shouting about honor while their soldiers died in confusion. He felt angry and helpless. He wanted to speak, but he knew no one would listen. He looked at the sky and wondered who these foreigners were and how they had learned to fight this way. He thought about how his people had always believed that courage was enough. But now he knew that courage without understanding was just a way to die faster. That night, he gathered a small group of soldiers who shared his thoughts. They talked about new ways to fight, about moving quietly, using the land for cover, and learning from the enemy instead of rushing blindly. They decided to watch the foreigners carefully, to learn how they moved and what patterns they followed. It was a small idea, but it was the beginning of something new. Rehan did not know that his small act of defiance would one day become the turning point of the war. The next day, the general ordered another attack. The soldiers obeyed because that was all they knew to do. They marched again toward the hills, their hearts heavy, their bodies tired. When the first shots came, they tried to hold their ground, but again the foreigners vanished like smoke. The battle ended before it even began. The survivors came back broken and silent. That night the camp was filled with the sound of the wounded crying softly in their sleep. The general sat inside his tent staring at the ground. He could no longer lie to himself. He had believed that war was about shouting louder and marching faster, but now he saw that it was about something deeper, something he did not understand. The foreign commander watched from afar through his device. He saw the camp lights flickering and the movement of tired men. He turned to his assistant and said in a calm voice that the locals were still fighting with pride instead of learning. He said that pride was the heaviest armor and the easiest to break. His assistant nodded and said nothing. The commander looked out at the dark hills and whispered that soon they would understand what true battle meant. As the night stretched on, Rayhan sat awake, listening to the wind. The camp was quiet, but his mind was not. He could still hear the distant hum of foreign machines somewhere beyond the hills. He knew that another attack would come soon, and he also knew that if they kept fighting the same way, they would all die. He closed his eyes and thought about his home, his family, and the faces of the men he had lost. He promised himself that he would not let their deaths be wasted. He would find a way to learn from the enemy, even if it meant breaking the old rules. He did not know how yet, but he knew that understanding was the only way to survive. The moon moved slowly across the sky, and somewhere far away, the sound of engines began again. The war that had started with pride was now becoming a lesson that would change everything they had ever believed about strength and courage. The days passed slowly, and the war began to spread like a storm that would not stop. The once proud soldiers who had marched with confidence now moved with quiet steps and tired faces. Every sunrise brought a feeling of fear that could not be hidden. The land that had been peaceful and full of life was now covered with smoke and broken ground. Villages near the border were empty, and the sound of birds had been replaced by the sound of distant machines that flew without warning. The soldiers no longer laughed or sang around the fire. They spoke little, each one lost in his own thoughts. They had learned that the enemy they faced was not like any they had imagined. These foreigners fought with calmness and patience. Their attacks came without sound, and they disappeared before anyone could strike back. Rayhan had started to keep a small notebook, though it was not for writing stories but for remembering what he saw. Every night he wrote about how the foreigners moved, how their machines sounded, and what they did before every strike. He told no one at first because he feared the older officers would laugh at him. They still believed that studying the enemy was useless, that all they needed was courage and loyalty. But Rayhan had seen too many men die for nothing. He had watched brave soldiers charge forward and fall before they even saw the faces of those they were fighting. He knew that if they did not learn soon, they would lose everything. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the hills, Rayhan sat near a fallen tree watching the smoke rise in the distance. A few soldiers sat beside him, silent and hungry. The air smelled of dust and sweat. One of them asked if he thought they could ever win this war. Rayhan did not answer right away. He looked at the man's face, dirty and tired, and said softly that maybe winning was not about fighting harder, but fighting smarter. The man looked confused and asked what that meant. Rayhan said that courage was good, but courage without knowledge was like walking blind into fire. The man nodded slowly, though he did not fully understand. Rayhan could see that the soldiers wanted hope but did not know where to find it. Later that night, a small group of foreign drones passed quietly over the camp. The soldiers looked up, their hearts pounding, but no bombs fell. The drones simply moved in circles and then vanished into the darkness. The next morning, when the soldiers woke up, they found that all their communication lines had stopped working. Their radios gave only static, and the wires were cut somewhere far away. The generals shouted for repairs, but nothing worked. It was as if the foreigners knew exactly how to make them blind and silent. Panic started to grow. Without communication, they could not call for help or know where the next attack would come from. Rayhan saw the fear spreading and decided to do something. He gathered a few of his closest men and told them that they needed to go out quietly at night and study how the foreigners worked. At first, the men hesitated. They were afraid of being caught. But Rayhan reminded them that waiting in fear was worse than taking a risk. That night, they moved out slowly through the forest, staying low and keeping their steps soft. The moon was bright enough to see the path, but not enough to make them visible. After walking for hours, they reached a ridge that overlooked a valley. What they saw below made them freeze in silence. The foreigners had built a temporary base. Their lights were dim, their movements organized, and their machines stood in perfect lines. They worked with quiet precision, speaking little and finishing every task with speed. Rayhan watched them carefully, noting how they guarded the perimeter and how their machines were powered. He realized that they were not as many as he had imagined, but their discipline made them powerful. He felt something strange, respect mixed with fear. When they returned to camp before dawn, Rayhan told his group to say nothing yet. He wanted to be sure of what he had seen. Over the next few nights, he went again and again, each time learning a little more. He noticed how the foreigners never wasted bullets, how they used the land for cover, and how they never attacked the same place twice in a row. He began to see a pattern. He wrote everything down, page after page, until his notebook was full of notes and drawings. One morning, when another attack destroyed half the camp, he decided he could not stay silent anymore. He went to the general's tent, his heart pounding, and asked for a few minutes to speak. The guards tried to stop him, but his voice was firm. When he entered, the general looked up with tired eyes. Rayhan placed the notebook on the table and said that he had been watching the enemy, and that he believed they could learn from them. The general frowned and asked what he meant. Rayhan explained that the foreigners were not unbeatable. They were clever and trained, but they followed patterns. If they studied those patterns, they could predict their next move and fight smarter. The general listened quietly for a moment, then laughed softly and said that the army had survived for generations without needing advice from a young officer who hid in the dark taking notes. He told Rayhan to go back to his unit and leave the thinking to those with experience. Rayhan wanted to argue but knew it would be useless. He saluted and walked out silently, his jaw tight. Outside, the soldiers were preparing again for battle. The foreign machines had been seen moving toward another hill nearby. The general ordered the army to defend it at all costs. Rayhan watched them march, their boots heavy, their faces expressionless. He knew they were walking into another trap. He wanted to stop them, to warn them, but he had no authority. When the fighting began, the sound of gunfire and explosions filled the air once more. The sky turned gray with smoke. Rayhan stayed back with a few of his men, trying to find a way to help. He realized that the foreigners always attacked from two directions, using one group to draw attention while another struck from behind. He told his men to move to the side and cut through the trees. When they reached the back of the hill, they saw the second group of foreigners setting up. Rayhan signaled his men to wait until the attack began, then strike quickly. When the foreigners moved forward, Rayhan and his men opened fire from the side. The surprise broke their formation. For the first time, the locals had caught them off guard. The foreigners retreated a little, and the main army noticed the change. The general saw the opportunity and ordered a full charge. The battle ended faster than anyone expected, and though many were lost, the army finally won a small victory. The soldiers cheered weakly, their joy mixed with disbelief. They had beaten the foreigners in one fight, but Rayhan knew it was not enough. Still, it gave them hope for the first time in weeks. That night, the general called Rayhan to his tent again. His face was less proud this time. He asked how he had known about the attack from behind. Rayhan told him everything, how he had been watching and learning. The general stayed quiet for a long time, then nodded slowly. He told Rayhan to continue his work and report directly to him. It was a small change, but it meant that someone had finally started to listen. Days turned into weeks and the fighting continued. The foreigners remained dangerous, but now the local soldiers began to move differently. They learned to stay quiet, to use shadows and speed. They learned to strike and disappear just like the foreigners did. Slowly, the balance began to shift. The foreigners no longer had the easy advantage they once enjoyed. Every attack became harder for them. Rayhan felt a new sense of purpose growing among his men. They were no longer fighting only with pride, but with understanding. They had started to learn what true battle meant. One evening, as Rayhan sat by the fire writing in his notebook, he heard the distant sound of the foreign machines again. He looked up at the sky and smiled faintly. He no longer felt helpless. He knew the war was far from over, but for the first time, he believed they had a chance. He had seen the truth. That knowledge was stronger than arrogance, and that courage without wisdom was only another way to lose. The fire flickered beside him, and he whispered softly to himself that the war had only just begun. But now they were ready to fight it the right way. The days turned into long weeks, and the war showed no sign of ending. The land that had once been full of life was now covered with smoke and broken metal. Every hill that had once been green now had the marks of fire and bombs. The soldiers who had once walked with pride now moved like shadows, always tired and always alert. They had learned to sleep with one eye open and to wake at the slightest sound. The army that had once believed in loud marches and bright flags now moved quietly and carefully. Rayhan's ideas had started to spread among the men. They no longer believed that shouting louder or marching faster would bring victory. They had begun to understand that to fight the foreigners they needed to think differently. Rayhan had grown from a young officer into someone the soldiers looked up to. He spoke little, but his words always carried sense. He taught his men to watch, to listen, and to wait for the right moment before moving. He told them that the foreigners were not monsters but men who used their minds as much as their weapons. The soldiers began to see what he meant. They started to set traps, use the land to their advantage, and confuse the enemy with false signals. The first few times they tried these new ways, they failed and lost men, but they kept trying. Slowly, they began to win small battles. Each small win gave them more belief that they could fight back. The general who had once ignored Rayhan now listened to him with respect. He would call him to his tent each evening and ask about what the enemy might do next. Rayhan would sit quietly, study the maps, and speak softly about what he had learned. He noticed that the foreigners always attacked in patterns. They used the same time of day, the same kind of movement, and the same formations. He told the general that if they could predict those moves, they could strike before the foreigners expected it. The general nodded and began to follow his advice. Soon the army stopped fighting with blind pride and started using strategy. It was slow progress, but it brought results. One night, as the wind howled over the mountains, the soldiers prepared for another attack. They had received word that the foreigners were gathering on the eastern ridge. Instead of waiting for them, Rayhan suggested that they move first. The general agreed, and under the cover of darkness, the army moved silently through the narrow paths. They reached the ridge before dawn and set up their defenses. When the foreigners arrived, expecting an easy strike, they were met with a surprise attack from below. The battle that followed was short but fierce. The locals fought with new strength and precision. For the first time, the foreigners retreated, leaving behind their equipment. The soldiers cheered softly, not with loud shouts but with quiet smiles. They had learned that victory did not need noise. After that day, things began to change in the camp. The soldiers felt a new kind of confidence. It was not the empty pride they once had, but a calm belief in their new way of fighting. Rayhan spent his nights writing in his notebook, recording every movement and every lesson. He believed that even in war, learning never stopped. The general often came to sit beside him and talk. He told Rayhan that he had once thought battle was only about courage, but now he understood that it was about understanding and patience. Rayhan listened silently and then said that courage still mattered, but only when guided by knowledge. However, not everyone agreed with Rayhan's way. Some of the older officers still clung to the old beliefs. They thought that fighting silently was cowardly. They wanted to attack directly and loudly to prove their strength. One of them, a colonel named Farid, often argued with Rayhan. He said that too much thinking made soldiers weak. Rayhan tried to explain that pride had already cost them too much, but Farid would not listen. One day, without orders, Farid led his men into a direct assault on a foreign position. He thought he would surprise them with boldness. Instead, the foreigners saw them coming and destroyed the entire unit in minutes. When the news reached the camp, silence fell. The soldiers looked at each other, their hearts heavy. The general said nothing, but his eyes told everyone that Rayhan had been right. That night, Rayhan sat alone outside his tent, staring at the stars. He felt no joy in being right. He thought about the men who had died. Because of pride, the war was teaching everyone the same lesson again and again, that arrogance only led to loss. He remembered how at the start of the war he too had believed that their army was unbeatable. Now he knew that no one was unbeatable, not even the foreigners. Everyone could bleed, everyone could fall, and everyone could learn. The difference was who learned faster. Days passed and the war began to shift in small but clear ways. The foreigners, who once moved freely, now found resistance wherever they went. The local soldiers had learned how to hide their movements, how to cut off supplies, and how to use the land to their advantage. Every tree, every rock, and every valley became part of their defense. The foreigners grew frustrated. They were used to winning easily, but now they faced an enemy who refused to play by old rules. Their attacks became less frequent and their losses grew. Rayhan noticed this change and told the general that the foreigners were now cautious. It was time to strike smarter and faster. They planned a new operation, one that would require silence and coordination. Rayhan's men would move through the forest and block the foreigners' escape routes, while the main army attacked from the front. It was risky, but they had no other choice. The night before the attack, Rayhan walked among his men, speaking softly to each of them. He told them to trust each other and to remember that fear was natural, but could not control them. The men nodded, their faces serious but calm. When dawn came, the plan was set in motion. The battle that followed was brutal but short. The foreigners were surrounded before they realized what was happening. When it was over, the locals had captured their first major foreign base. The soldiers stood among the ruins, tired and dirty but proud in a new way. They had done something that once seemed impossible. When the general walked through the captured base, he saw the strange equipment and the advanced machines. He realized how far behind they had been, and how lucky they were to have adapted in time. He turned to Rayhan and said that if they had not changed, they would have lost everything. Rayhan looked at the machines quietly and said that understanding the enemy was the first step to defeating them. The general nodded and said that understanding themselves had been the second. As night fell, the camp was quiet again. The soldiers cleaned their weapons, repaired their gear, and spoke softly among themselves. There was no celebration, no loud cheering, only a quiet sense of relief. They knew the war was not over. The foreigners were still out there and they would return. But now the soldiers were ready in ways they had never been before. They were no longer fighting only with their muscles but with their minds. Rayhan walked to the edge of the camp and looked out at the dark hills. The wind blew softly, carrying the smell of smoke and earth. He thought about all the men who had fallen, all the lessons learned through pain. He knew that the war had changed him forever. He was no longer the young officer who had once dreamed of glory. Now he only wanted peace, but he also knew that peace would not come easily. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened to the distant sound of engines far away. The foreigners were still moving somewhere beyond the mountains. The war was not done with them yet, but this time, they would face a different kind of army, one that had learned the true meaning of battle. As he walked back to his tent, he saw the general standing alone near the fire. The older man looked at him and said that maybe one day, when this was all over, people would remember not the war itself but the lesson it taught. Rayhan smiled faintly and said that if people learned, maybe there would be no need for another war. The general looked at the fire and nodded slowly. The wind blew the flames sideways, and for a moment both men stood in silence, watching the sparks rise into the dark sky. Somewhere beyond those stars, the enemy was waiting, and the next phase of the war was already beginning. The days after the capture of the foreign base brought a strange calm to the land. The soldiers walked through the quiet fields and broken roads, feeling as if the world itself was holding its breath. Rayhan watched the men as they repaired the base and turned it into their new stronghold. He could see that they were proud, but beneath that pride was a tiredness that no rest could fix. The war had changed everyone, and even in victory there was a shadow that followed them. The general called Rayhan one evening and told him that the foreigners were regrouping far beyond the mountains. They were bringing more machines and more men. The general said that the next fight would be harder than anything before. Rayhan nodded quietly because deep down he had known this would happen. The foreigners would not give up so easily. The soldiers began to prepare for what was coming. They trained harder, built stronger defenses, and learned to use some of the foreign equipment they had captured. Rayhan watched them closely and made sure that they understood how to fight in the new way. He reminded them that the foreigners were fast thinkers and that every mistake could cost lives. He walked through the camp at night, checking on the men and talking to them about home. He knew that keeping their hearts steady was as important as keeping their weapons ready. Some nights he could see them sitting around small fires, sharing stories of their families and dreams of peace. It made him realize how much they had all lost, yet how much they still held on to. One morning, a scout came running with urgent news. The foreigners had been seen moving through the valley near the river. They were building new camps and preparing for a large assault. The general gathered his officers and everyone turned to Rayhan for advice. He studied the map and pointed to the narrow paths that led to the valley. He said that if they could cut off the enemy's supplies and surround them from both sides, they could weaken them before the main fight began. The general agreed and gave Rayhan command of one part of the operation. It was a great responsibility, but Rayhan did not hesitate. He knew the land better than anyone, and he trusted his men. For 3 days and nights, Rayhan and his soldiers moved through the thick forest. They carried little food and almost no rest, but they kept going. The air was heavy with silence, and every sound made them alert. Finally, they reached the edge of the valley. Below them, they could see the foreign camp with its shining machines and tall lights. Rayhan watched through his scope and saw how organized and calm the foreigners were. He could tell that they were preparing for something big. He gave his men orders to stay hidden and wait for his signal. They would not attack yet. He wanted to see how the enemy moved and what patterns they followed. For 2 nights they watched quietly, counting the soldiers, the vehicles, and the supply routes. When the time was right, Rayhan sent a signal to the general. Everything was ready. At dawn, the attack began. The main army struck from the front while Rayhan's team cut through the supply lines from behind. The foreigners were taken by surprise, but they quickly recovered and fought back with force. The sky filled with smoke and the ground shook with explosions. Rayhan shouted orders as bullets whistled past him. His men fought with everything they had, using every rock and tree for cover. They had learned how to fight smart, how to move fast and strike where it mattered most. The foreigners tried to bring in reinforcements, but their lines were broken. Still, the fight was not easy. Many soldiers fell, and Rayhan could feel the weight of each loss. The air was filled with cries, fire, and dust, and yet the men kept going, their hearts stronger than their fear. After hours of fighting, the foreigners began to pull back. The locals had managed to push them out of the valley, but it came at a heavy price. The ground was covered with the fallen, both friend and foe. The smell of smoke mixed with the bitter wind. Rayhan stood among his men, his face covered in dirt and blood. He could barely hear anything over the ringing in his ears. The general arrived later that evening and looked around the battlefield in silence. He put his hand on Rayhan's shoulder and said that they had done well. But Rayhan did not feel victorious. He looked at the lifeless faces of his soldiers and wondered if this was truly what victory meant. That night, as they buried the fallen, Rayhan sat alone near the river. The water flowed quietly, carrying away the ashes of war. He thought about all the people who had believed that battle was about glory. Now he knew that there was no glory, only survival. The war had stripped away all illusions. He had once dreamed of being a hero, but now he only wanted to protect the few who were still alive. He looked up at the sky and saw faint stars through the smoke. He wondered if the foreigners were looking at the same sky, feeling the same pain. For a moment he felt a strange sadness for them too. They were enemies, yes, but they were also human. Both sides had lost too much already. A few days later, news came that the foreigners were retreating deeper into their territory. It seemed like a victory, but Rayhan knew better. He knew they would return with greater strength. The general called a meeting and said that they had to prepare for a long war. The foreigners were not running away. They were regrouping. Rayhan listened quietly and then said that maybe it was time to find another way. The general looked at him confused and asked what he meant. Rayhan said that maybe it was time to talk. The room went silent. Some officers looked shocked, others angry. They said that talking to the enemy was a sign of weakness. But Rayhan said that the strongest warriors were those who could end a war without fighting. The general did not answer right away. Later that night, he called Rayhan to his tent. He said that the idea of peace was noble, but it might not be possible. The foreigners had come for power, not friendship. Rayhan nodded but said that even then someone had to try. The general looked at him for a long time and finally agreed to let him send a message through a captured radio channel. Rayhan wrote simple words asking for a meeting away from battle just to talk. Days passed with no answer, and everyone thought it was a waste of time. But then one evening the radio crackled with a reply. The foreigners agreed to meet under a white flag at the border hill. When the day came, Rayhan and a small group went to the meeting place. The air was cold and tense. On the other side, a few foreign officers waited. They looked tired, just like Rayhan's men. There was no hatred in their eyes, only exhaustion. Rayhan stepped forward and spoke slowly. He said that both sides had lost too much and that if they continued, there would be nothing left to fight for. The foreign commander listened quietly. He said that he too was tired of sending his men to die, but he also said that he did not make the final decisions. He was just following orders. Rayhan understood. They talked for a while longer and agreed to a temporary ceasefire to bury their dead and help the wounded. It was not peace, but it was a beginning. When Rayhan returned to the camp, the soldiers were surprised to hear about the meeting. Some were happy, others doubtful. The general told them that it was a small step, but an important one. For the first time since the war began, there was a night without gunfire. The silence felt strange but peaceful. The men slept deeply without fear of being attacked. Rayhan walked among them, watching their calm faces. He realized how powerful peace could be, even if it was only for one night. The next morning, the sun rose over the hills, painting the land with soft light. The smoke had cleared, and for a moment everything looked normal again. Rayhan stood quietly, feeling the warmth on his face. He knew the war was not over and more battles might come, but he also knew that something had changed. The soldiers had learned the truth that battle was not only about strength, but about understanding. Not only about pride, but about purpose. He thought of all the lives lost, all the lessons learned, and felt that maybe they had begun to understand what it really meant to fight. As the day went on, he looked toward the horizon where the foreigners had disappeared. Somewhere beyond those mountains another army was waiting, and the final part of this long struggle was yet to come. But Rayhan was ready, not because he wanted war, but because he now understood its meaning. The real battle, he thought, was not against the foreigners, but against the ignorance that had started it all. The days of silence after the ceasefire felt unreal to everyone. The soldiers woke up without the sound of explosions or orders. They moved slowly, unsure if the quiet would last. Some dared to smile, others stayed alert, their hands still close to their weapons. Rayhan walked through the camp each morning, watching them work, repair, and talk. He could see how much they wanted peace, but he also knew that deep inside, no one trusted the stillness. He felt the same. The war had made him cautious, and every calm day felt like the calm before a storm. The general called Rayhan to his tent one afternoon. He said that scouts had seen strange movements in the hills. It looked like the foreigners were building something, maybe preparing for another strike. Rayhan listened quietly, feeling the weight of the news. The general said he was tired of waiting and wanted to attack before it was too late. Rayhan thought for a while and then said that maybe they should wait and watch a little longer. He had learned that rushing into battle often led to mistakes. The general looked at him and said that patience had saved them before, so he agreed to wait. For the next few days, they observed carefully. Rayhan sent small groups to gather information, and each report painted a clearer picture. The foreigners were not preparing for war this time. They were setting up large machines that looked like they were clearing land, not building weapons. It made no sense. Rayhan decided to go himself with a small team to see what was really happening. They moved at night through the quiet forests and climbed the rocky hills until they could see the foreign camp below. What they saw surprised them. The foreigners were not wearing battle armor but working clothes. They were building shelters, treating their wounded, and setting up food stations. Rayhan realized that they were not preparing to attack, but to stay. It seemed they were stranded far from home, with no reinforcements coming. He watched in silence, feeling something shift inside him. The enemy he had feared for so long looked just as tired and broken as his own men. When he returned to camp, he told the general everything. The general listened with a frown and said that maybe the foreigners were pretending. Rayhan said he did not think so. He had seen their faces. They were not pretending to be weak. They were weak. The general leaned back and sighed. He said that if what Rayhan said was true, then the war was already over, even if no one had signed it yet. But he also warned that peace could be dangerous too, because peace made men forget how fragile it was. Days turned into weeks, and neither side made a move. The soldiers started to rebuild villages and roads that had been destroyed. The local people came back to their homes slowly, their eyes filled with fear and hope at the same time. Rayhan helped where he could. He worked with the soldiers to carry wood, fix broken roofs, and dig wells. He no longer felt like a man of war, but a man trying to heal what war had broken. The soldiers followed his example. They began to see that real strength was not in killing, but in rebuilding. One morning, a foreign group came to the edge of the valley carrying a white flag again. Rayhan went to meet them with a few men. This time, there was no tension. The foreign commander from before stepped forward. He looked thinner and older, his uniform dirty and worn. He said they had no orders, no contact with their leaders, and no supplies left. He said his men were sick and starving. He did not ask for surrender or negotiation. He asked for help. Rayhan stood still for a moment, thinking about all the lives that had been lost because of pride on both sides. Then he nodded and told his men to bring food and medicine. When the locals saw this, some were angry. They said that the foreigners did not deserve mercy. They remembered the villages that had burned, the families that had died. But Rayhan told them that mercy was not a sign of weakness. It was what made them human. He said that if they had learned anything from the war, it should be that hate only leads to more pain. Slowly, the people began to understand. They brought food, water, and blankets for the foreigners. Both sides worked side by side, silent but peaceful. It was strange to see them together after so much blood had been spilled, but it also felt right. The general came to see this with his own eyes. He walked among the foreign soldiers and saw how broken they were. He turned to Rayhan and said that he had never imagined a day like this. Rayhan said that maybe this was the real victory, the kind that no one could measure in land or weapons. The general smiled faintly and said that maybe he had been wrong about what battle truly meant. Rayhan said that everyone had been wrong once. Months passed and the land began to heal. The foreigners were allowed to leave slowly, and the locals escorted them safely to the border. There were no more shots fired, no more orders shouted, just quiet farewells. Rayhan stood on the hill one morning and watched the last group of foreigners disappear into the horizon. The wind carried their voices faintly, and for the first time in a long while the air smelled clean. He felt no anger, no triumph, only peace. After the foreigners were gone, life slowly returned to normal. The villages were rebuilt and children laughed again in the fields. The soldiers who had survived went back to their families. Some stayed behind to protect the borders, but the battles were over. The general retired to his home by the river, and Rayhan visited him often. They would sit in silence, drinking tea, watching the sun set behind the hills that had once burned with fire. Sometimes they talked about the war. Sometimes they said nothing at all. They both knew that silence spoke louder than any words. One evening, as the sky turned orange, the general looked at Rayhan and said that he should write down everything that had happened. He said that people needed to remember not just the war, but what it taught. Rayhan agreed and began to write. His words were simple, just like his thoughts. He wrote about the mistakes, the pride, the pain, and the lessons. He wrote that they had thought they understood battle, but they were wrong. He wrote that the real strength was not in destroying, but in understanding. That peace was harder than war, but worth every struggle. Years later, his writings spread among the people. Soldiers and leaders read his words and began to see war differently. They learned that courage was not in fighting the longest, but in knowing when to stop. Rayhan never called himself a hero. He said that heroes were those who learned from their past and never repeated it. He spent his remaining years teaching young soldiers how to think before they fought, how to protect before they destroyed. He told them that war was not a story of victory but a warning. One cold morning, Rayhan walked alone to the same hill where the war had once begun.